Hey, Hammy here. This video is part one of section 6.1, and where we begin the chapter on Mendel's work, and we start to dive into genetics and DNA and all that involves here. There's a good chance that you've heard of this father of genetics before. His name is Gregor Mendel. He actually grew up in Austria on a farm, kind of near and dear to my heart. I relate to this guy a lot, except I didn't do all these genetics experiments. I grew up on a farm in Austria, so enjoyed working outdoors, was often, in the fields, enjoyed planting, growing things. Went to the University of Vienna, where he studied biology and math, and his professors really encouraged him to do experimentation, to actually collect data and keep track of results. And it was this unique combination of bio and math that we think really led to sort of his discoveries. Having a science brain, being good at experimentation, and also having kind of that mathy brain that was able to process the numbers and see patterns. After the university, he ended up being a monk in Czechoslovakia. And so he had, time along with the religious work that he did. He also had a lot of time to spend in the garden outside the monastery where he grew pea plants and discovered the basic principles of inheritance. And we still refer back to him today, 150 some years later. We think, again, that he made these discoveries because he had a curious mind. He wanted to know why things happen, what happens when he crosses different things. He had sound scientific methods. Okay, he did a lot of experimentation, hands-on. He collected a lot of data. He had a lot of replicates. He counted thousands of pea plants in order to increase his sample size. And a lot of good luck has contributed to the situation too, because he picked traits that happened to not be on the same chromosome. So they weren't linked, which those patterns we have found do not fit into some of his principles that he came up with. So he was lucky he picked characteristics that kind of separated and weren't connected together, and he saw the patterns that he did. In Mendel's time, people obviously knew about inheritance. Mankind had been dealing with inheritance for centuries, if not millennia, right? Farmers would cross crops and animals. We were doing selected breeding for a long time, and we knew that parents passed their traits on to their offspring. Well, the general accepted idea is when you cross two things, for example, down here, you cross a red flower and a white flower, sort of the accepted theory of inheritance was called the blending theory. So if you crossed red and white, they would mix to make kind of a pink colored flower. And if that didn't happen, then something went wrong. There was a mutation or something didn't work like it should. If you cross, mom was really tall, dad was really short, then the kid should be medium size. And so they had this blending theory. However, Mendel noticed when he was growing pea plants in the garden that his plants did not follow this pattern on a very regular basis, more than could just be a coincidence or some mutation. When he crossed tall plants with short plants, all of the offspring were tall, not medium-sized. They were all only the one phenotype or characteristic of the one parent. And so this made him wonder, that curiosity of the mind that we talked about at the beginning of the year for a good scientist, he wondered why this happened. And so he set up a bunch of crosses with his pea plants, probably in the monastery garden. The Pisum sativum is the scientific name, remember genus and species. And he experimented with over 30,000 pea plants. In his book, he recorded all his data. And if you count up how many pea plants he counted, it was a lot. So don't get mad at me when I make you flip a coin 100 times in class. He counted 30,000 pea plants over a couple years. Why peas? He could grow them very quickly. okay, within a growing season. They were very easy to raise. I mean, he could just keep them in the garden. They didn't wander off on him like animals might, okay, and they just would grow in the soil. You'd have to weed them and tend to them, but they were easy to grow within a garden. And the traits were very easy to see, and it usually had two like opposing characteristics or appearances. And there were 7 different traits that he picked. For seed shape, okay, he did round, okay, and wrinkled seeds. They could also be yellow or green. The flower colors on the pea plant were white, okay, or purple or violet. The pods were either full, like smooth, or constricted, where it kind of bumps over the peas. The pods were green or yellow. Where the pods where the flowers and the pea pods actually formed on the plant could be axial, in other words, coming off of the stem. This is characteristic number 6, or terminal. They were just out here, just at the ends of each little branch. And the actual plant itself, size of the plant, tall or short. So you see, it had 7 characteristics, and it was either this or this, and it was very easy visually. Didn't need a microscope or anything like that. It was very easy to see the characteristic of the plant. When he crossed them, get a bunch of peas and plant them, the next generation, he could very easily see the traits. The third thing that was really important was how the pea plants reproduced. Okay, now pea plants are plants. Okay, they are flowering plants. So if you kind of the general structure of a flower over here, okay, the female part of the flower is here on the inside, okay, where it has kind of this stigma up top that's sort of sticky. And then over here, you have the stamen over here, which is the male part of the plant, would produce these pollen grains. Okay, and then the pollen grains would land on the sticky stigma here, and it would go down through the style. Okay, and they kind of burrow down in here to number 6 over here, which is the ovules, or in animals, we would call that the eggs. So the eggs were in here, and the pollen then fertilizes the female part of the flower, which is the eggs, and then those would become the pea seeds, and the petals would fall off the flower, and those become the pea seeds. The nice thing about pea plants is that the flowers had kind of this umbrella shape, okay? So he could control where that pollen was going. Okay, you can't do genetics experiments with pollen just flying all over the garden. Okay, because then peas would be crossing and you couldn't control where that pollen was going and which plants were crossing with which plants. With pea plants, because of the umbrella shape, all the pollen stayed within that flower. So they would self-pollinate. They would pollinate themselves. Okay, and he could control. Okay, he could control which plants pollinated which plants. Okay, he could come in with a scissors, and if he didn't want this one to self-pollinate, he'd cut off, okay, the ends here, okay, the little anthers there that produce the pollen. He'd snip them off and just let the female part there, and he could collect pollen with a little paintbrush, and he could take that pollen and cross which plant he wanted to cross with which plant. So this became very important part of the pea plant, and why we think maybe he decided to cross pea plants, because he could control who was crossing with whom.